This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Gerasimos Tsourapas, political science lecturer at the University of Birmingham. Hello, Gerasimos, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me.
We are speaking on Wednesday, September 2nd, a few days after Greek authorities tightened health restrictions and pandemic-related guidelines at Moria camp on the island of Lesbos, where the number of COVID cases has crept up in recent weeks. Moria camp was built for 3,000 people, as I'm guessing you know, but is now home to more than 4 times that number. So an outbreak there could potentially spread like wildfire. The same goes for a node on the other end of the so-called migration railway, if you will, northeast Syria's Al-Hol refugee camp, which recorded its first case of COVID-19 just last week. My question for you, Gerasimos, is to what extent should we fear a major outbreak at these migrant and refugee camps? Has this sort of thing happened before, a migrant or refugee population devastated by some disease or virus or bringing it to a host country?
I would say that this is definitely something that is making the news here in Greece, where I'm currently staying at. And we see this more and more as something that can potentially go quite out of hand, in the sense that most of these refugees across the islands in the eastern part of the Aegean have been under tight lockdown since March, late March actually. So the authorities here have been quite careful, but given that these camps are really not built for the tens of thousands of people they're currently hosting, it is highly likely that the situation can get easily out of hand, unfortunately.
Is it your sense that at least Greek authorities have a decent handle on it, like it's not getting out of control, at least not yet?
So far into the summer, it has been to the benefit of Greek authorities to maintain control over COVID as tightly as possible, particularly given that the Greek economy, as you probably know very well as well, is heavily reliant on tourism revenue. Mm-hmm. So they do not want any sort of major outbreak of COVID across these islands, across the Aegean. And of course, the Greek state itself is in dire need of minimizing COVID, given the very, very high toll it would take on a very overstretched healthcare system here. So I think that they're really trying to contain it as much as possible. Of course, with the caveat that this ultimately infringes on the human rights of the refugees themselves, right? So keep in mind that restricting their mobility at the dead of summer, when temperatures rise to 35 and 40 degrees, is really not something that is ideal.
Last year, you wrote a journal article about refugee rentier states, basically countries that seek to leverage their position as refugee host states for material gain. Probably no country has done this more aggressively than Turkey, which hosts some 3.5 or 4 million Syrian refugees and leveraged the 2015-2016 refugee wave into $6 billion in refugee support funds from the European Union. And then back in February, this past February, Turkey followed through on President Erdogan's threat to open the gates to Europe and urge refugees in Turkey to head toward the Greek border, which it said was totally open, which was not the case. Observers have accused Erdogan of weaponizing refugees to pressure Europe into providing still more funding for these refugees in Turkey, or to come to Turkey's aid in Syria's Idlib province, where some 2 million displaced people still today, six months later, are living in ad hoc camps along Turkey's border. Is that how you saw Turkey's actions back in February and March? And did Erdogan's move succeed in your view?
The way you're quite correct. The way I approached this when this was happening is that my feeling was that the way Turkey was trying to respond to the Syrian refugee crisis was very much the same way that some countries that are endowed with natural resources try to take advantage of them. So I made the connection that much like Saudi Arabia, for instance, is an oil rentier state, in which case it relies on revenues from oil to support much of its government and state expenses. So does Turkey, and actually quite a few other states across the world try to use the fact that they host a large number of refugees to gain economic support from the international community, and particularly from Western states. So I identified that they tend to follow one of two strategies. They either tend to cooperate with the international community, or they tend to be much more coercive. And in Turkish case, it was much more of a blackmailing approach, as we would say in international relations, than a back-scratching approach. So Erdogan was quite firm and adamant about the quid pro quo that his government was putting forth in terms of the European Union responses. Bear in mind, though, that this is not really new, right? If we go back a few decades, we'll remember Gaddafi and Libya doing the same with Italy and Malta. Or if we go to the other side of the world, Australia and Manus Island and other small islands in the vicinity have had similar approaches to the management of refugees. What's different here is that it became really heavily institutionalized. The European Union got involved. We had firm promises. It was a very prominent and direct issue-linked strategy in which refugees become commodified, I would argue.
It's interesting. That suggests that Turkey actually doesn't want to open the gates, as Erdogan says, and allow them to leave because they are a commodity that benefits the state.
That's actually true. So yeah, that's one of the good points, the very interesting points that comes out of it. And of course, Turkey, and we're not, of course, trying to paint one party as particularly bad and the other party as particularly good, because reality is much grayer than that. But Turkey does host the largest number of Syrian refugees worldwide. So it has about, as you said, over 3 million refugees. And this is a number that the European Union or Greece even could not really cope with. So even opening up and allowing a few hundreds of thousands of refugees to come through, Erdogan is very clearly sending a message to Brussels and to European leaders that he believes, at least, that he holds the power in this type of negotiation. You asked me how successful that is, though, and I would say much like Saudi Arabia's use of oil as a weapon back in the 1973 war, the Arab-Israeli war, it's a very blunt type of instrument. So it might work the first time around, and we saw, you were covering this as well, I think, back in 2015, 2016, yes. European leaders really scrambling to find a solution, because Erdogan would say, I remember, we'll just put them all on buses and we'll send them over. And what is that you can do? Nothing. But over the years, this blunt kind of instrument is less likely to yield the responses that the aggressor, quote unquote, would seek. So he did try to do this again now in March 2020. And my understanding of this is that it wasn't as successful as the Turkish government had hoped, at least.
Turkey is not seen as the only aggressor here by some. In July, a London-based research group, Forensics Architecture, concluded it was highly probable that Mohammed al-Arab, 22-year-old from Aleppo, was shot by Greek soldiers in March as he joined thousands of migrants seeking to enter Greece. Athens has said it didn't use live fire, but clearly water cannons, rubber bullets, and aggressive Coast Guard boats were involved in kind of staving off this migrant wave that we've said that Erdogan unleashed. And Greece and the European Union, which largely supported the Greek response, are being urged to investigate al-Arab's death. Greece has in recent weeks also been accused of pushing migrant boats out of its territorial waters and back toward Turkey. You've, of course, studied migration a great deal, Gerasimos, and I believe you're a Greek citizen. So I wonder what you thought of the Greek response to the migrant wave we saw back in February, March, a response that maybe killed at least one Syrian refugee. Did Greek authorities go too far?
What do you see? That's a great question. What do you see here is a clear example of migration diplomacy, I would say. So the conduct of foreign policy, in this case, this bilateral relationship between Greece and Turkey that has always been fraught for decades and upon decades, infused with this phenomenon of forced migration, in which we have both sides trying to manipulate refugees and forced migrants for their own benefit. One of the interesting things that came out of 2015-2016, before I answer your question about what happened this year, is that we had the then Minister of Defense, Panos Kamenos, if you remember, trying to also use refugees as an instrument of leverage against Germany and against Brussels. So this was the time Greece was trying to negotiate the bailout agreement. And seeing
so Greece was not above above acting sort of like Turkey.
Indeed. And this is one of the dangerous things that comes out of this, that we have a phenomenon of diffusion. As it becomes clearer that a couple of states can win something out of using refugees as an instrument in foreign policy, more and more are likely to use it. Kenya, for instance, of all places, has been threatening to shut down its largest refugee camp unless it gets more international aid. But yes, so even Greece, even an European Union member state, has not been loath to instrumentalize refugees. And I think this is what happened in 2020. Both parties, both the Greeks and the Turks, tried to use what happened on the Evros border, on the land border between Greece and Turkey, for their own advantage. So the Turks, of course, sought to portray Greeks and the Europeans as duplicitous, as, of course, talking about human rights, talking about refugees, but when it comes down to it, they actually close up the borders and refuse to take anyone and even shoot them. And then from the Greek side perspective, we have a narrative of Turkey as this aggressor power that would not stop at anything. They would even encourage. There were reports, for instance, of buses being driven on Turkish governorate's expenses, of hundreds of thousands or hundreds of refugees coming in from all over Turkey to the Greek border, so as to create a mini crisis for this new government that was in place then. So I think reality is quite there's a war of narratives going on there in terms of the role of refugees in this bilateral relationship.
Okay, so now let's move on to your recent work on how autocracies respond to all this migration, specifically the migration of their own citizens. A study of yours on autocratic strategies of transnational repression was published online just this week. You list 6 acts these regimes take against their diaspora: surveillance, which is primarily keeping an eye on them and their actions, directly threatening them in some way, coercion by proxy, enforced disappearances, coerced return, and finally, the most extreme step, killing them. You also write that authoritarian regimes tend to embrace several of these strategies, combine them, and Turkey, I think, certainly does that. I'd like to start with surveillance. I spoke with a German parliamentarian a few weeks ago who said Turkey had 6,000 spies in Germany, a reference, I was guessing, to both Turkish imams, which have been accused by the German state of spying for Turkey, and thousands of pro-AKP informants across Germany. You mentioned in that journal article that Turkey developed a smartphone app for its German diaspora community to report potential members of the Gülen movement to Ankara. I was wondering, how effective do you think these sort of tactics are? What sort of impact do they have on the diaspora community, both in terms of encouraging people to toe the government line and also keeping tabs on dissidents?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, actually, and I think the uniqueness of these kinds of measures is that they can be potentially quite low cost. So they really don't involve any sort of high expenditure on the state's perspective to recruit some people and to sort of offer some rewards. And at the end of the day, they don't really need to be quite active. So even with us just repeating these numbers and these phenomena, this sort of, you said 6,000 spies, right? It already puts a note of fear to anyone that is remotely associated with the Turkish state or has relatives living in Turkey about doing anything that might be perceived as wrongful by Turkish state authorities. So it's very useful, I think, in creating a sense of fear and anxiety and uncertainty about the kind of people that you socialize with when you're abroad, when you're in the diaspora, and the kind of monitoring that takes place. And I think this is what makes this quite potent, actually, as one of the instruments of authoritarianism that we haven't really studied as much nowadays.
You just said there's a low cost. This is a low cost measure, but there is a potential diplomatic cost in troubling relations between these states, as it happened between Germany and Turkey, and the Netherlands and Turkey, and France and Turkey. Is that right?
Absolutely. So I think Turkey is somewhat of an outlier in the sense that Erdogan appears quite eager, or I shouldn't say eager. Erdogan is quite keen to go on the offensive and to publicly blame European governments and adopt a very anti-European rhetoric that I think appeals to a lot of AKP voters domestically. If you remember back at the referendum time, he was talking about the Dutch as being remnants of Nazis and being...
Right, you're referring to, the 2017 referendum on the presidential system, yes.
Correct. At that point, the Dutch authorities, I think, had denied entry to a few of the AKP politicians that were campaigning on that referendum to talk to the Turkish diaspora in the Netherlands. And Erdogan was quite keen to adopt a very anti-Dutch rhetoric, which was quite extreme, but it appeared that it had a unique sort of domestic appeal to his voters. So Erdogan, I think I'm not sure it's a high cost strategy for him. I think it's something that appeals to the broader public he talks to, actually.
You also mentioned blacklisting, which can be done by both governments and their proxies abroad. The article mentions that members of the Turkish community in Germany issued social media calls for the boycott of businesses linked to the Gulen movement back in 2016. Quote, "We are outing these parallel forces and their henchmen," one entry read that listed 20 businesses across Stuttgart. Also, the Turkish government has sought 60,000 Interpol red notices against citizens abroad. You mentioned that this is more than 4 times the number of notices issued by Interpol in 2016. I was wondering, how effective are steps like these in kind of blacklisting these people abroad in the countries where they are today?
Well, in terms of the latter example you cite, so cooperation between Turkey and Interpol, which is the international agency that carries out arrest warrants for people that have fled a country's jurisdiction. This has been surprisingly potent. This is something that Turkey did in the aftermath of the coup d'etat, the attempt that took place. And one of the things that Turkey was trying to do is to issue as many notices as possible against citizens abroad via Interpol, hoping that at least some of them might stick. So you have 60,000 red notices issued, and Turkish officials would hope that, well, even if we don't really manage to arrest 60,000 dissenters, which is an incredible number, just a fraction of that would actually send a very potent signal to anybody trying to say anything wrong or anything contrary to what we stand for abroad. So I think this is something that we again haven't researched as much, this cooperation between authoritarian regimes and organizations like Interpol. So there's a lot to be said there. In terms of the diaspora, that's very interesting because it again falls under the jurisdiction of host states, right? So you might have followed what's happening now in France with Emmanuel Macron coming out supporting Greece in terms of what is happening now in the Eastern Mediterranean, and all sorts of small or bigger diaspora communities in France are are perceived as maybe mobilizing in support of Erdogan within France. So it creates a
Right,
whole
and Macron, let me just say, he gave a speech in January and kind of called this separatism, this support for a Turkish state and a Turkish Islam within France.
Yes, yes. So we're scrambling as European states to find sort of language and policy frameworks to respond to what's happening. So when you have French or German citizens that clearly are able to be influenced by political events in their country of origin, then it becomes something quite interesting for international relations, at least.
Yeah, I'm wondering what might these countries do when these things are happening. And Germany is a strong, stable democracy with a vast intelligence system, but still it appears to be home to thousands of Turkish spies and informants. And just last year, there was a Chechen Georgian dissident killed in a Berlin park in broad daylight.
Yes.
And you mentioned how Erdogan threatened to sanction the Netherlands after Dutch officials barred Turkish officials from campaigning there. So what can these host countries do to curb this, if not eliminate entirely?
Yes, it's increasing. It's quite tough actually to find a solution to this. I would say two things. One is that Turkey is not alone in this. So if you look just at the Middle East, for instance, my first book was on Egypt and Egyptian diaspora policymaking. The Egyptian state has been very active, particularly in Germany, in terms of tracking down dissent or using Egyptian citizens abroad as informants, if you want. And Iran is doing something very similar to its large Iranian diaspora in the Netherlands. So this is a wider issue that somehow
Russia as well, of course. Sorry.
Russia, absolutely. So we need to find a way to resolve this. But of course, the other side of the coin is that for a number of years, a lot of these European governments, European states, did not hesitate collaborating with many of these governments. So if you look at Turkey, for instance, the Kurdistan Workers' Party's actions back in the day and Turkish attempts to sort of silence these opposition groups abroad, this did not happen unilaterally. At many times there was cooperation with German authorities. So I guess the lesson for us Europeans is that perhaps we can't have it both ways, if you know what I mean. So you need to be much more morally strict, if you want, about your stance, and then you'll be able to perhaps develop some certain policies to resolve these matters.
Mm-hmm. At one point in the article, you write, quote, academics working on transnational authoritarianism have often found themselves targeted by the very autocracies they seek to study. You just said your first book was about Egypt. You've written about Turkey, Russia, China. I have to ask, has that ever happened to you?
This has happened. I'm happy you caught that actually. So because I was considering whether I should include that note or not, and I did the right thing by including it. I've had a lot of discussions leading up to this article with colleagues across both sides of the Atlantic, so both in the States and in Europe, and they were all telling me the same thing, that it's there is a climate of fear and uncertainty in terms of the research that can be done in terms of transnational repression and these governments' attempts to silence communities and critics abroad. I have not experienced this firsthand, but I know of good colleagues that have told me about, for instance, conferences, so academic conferences in which embassy officials turned up and stayed quite prominently on the front row, paying very good attention to what is happening, and then writing things down and then leaving before the end of the. So little things like that can have a huge impact on academic freedom, and we still don't have. Do
you think it is curbing some of the outspokenness, some of the writing, the studies that might appear otherwise?
There is. I would say there is definitely a sentiment of trying to balance things in terms of putting ourselves or putting our interviewees in danger, and critiquing what we see as abuses of power. And I don't think we're the only ones in terms of academia overall. This seems to be a broader crisis in what we can do and what we cannot do So it's something to be reckoned with.
A few last questions for you. You include an Erdogan quote in your article: "Wherever they may go, we will wrap them up and bring them here, God willing," he says. This is a reference to coerced returns or renditions, which you write are often linked to interstate migration diplomacy strategies. Turkey has requested the extradition of 504 people suspected to be part of the Gulen movement, including, of course, Gulen himself in the United States. 107 so-called fugitives, you write, have been brought back as of March 2019, some of them forcibly, and Ahval has reported on this a good deal, such as Turkey snatching its citizens in Kosovo or Moldova. I was wondering how you see this as different from the U.S. practice of extraordinary rendition. In both cases, the subject is viewed as a terrorist, an enemy of the state, and the fact that in Turkey's case, the victims or the subjects are Turkish citizens would seem to give Turkey more right to act.
That's a very good question, actually, and this is something that I'm looking at now with a couple of colleagues, and you're absolutely right. So Turkey has been doing this, and Ahval has been covering this quite a lot. I know Nate Chetkan at Freedom House, Erdi Öztürk, and others have written on this particularly brutal form of renditions. The issue that you raise is particularly important because by calling this phenomenon transnational authoritarianism, we kind of perhaps suggest that liberal democracies stand at a higher ground than the rest of the countries that engage in this. And this is not exactly true. The line between a liberal democracy and an illiberal regime becomes blurry and blurrier the more we go into 2020 in particular, I suppose. So it's America, it's the United States. It is also countries like Israel, for instance, that have engaged in similar practices in the past. So there is something to be said about this phenomenon actually transcending the limits of authoritarianism and becoming something that even democracies do by engaging in distinctly illiberal practices. So you're absolutely right.
You also co-authored a piece this year for Freedom House on coercion by proxy, in which rather than target a particular dissenter abroad, autocracies may choose to threaten or punish their family members back home. Coercion by proxy constitutes the actual or threatened use of physical or other sanctions against an individual, you write, within the jurisdiction of a state for the purpose of repressing a target outside that jurisdiction. Iran has done this with dissidents abroad, as has Turkey. One case that comes to mind to me is the professional basketball player Enes Kanter, who has spoken out widely about the Erdogan regime, which has in turn prosecuted and imprisoned his father back in Turkey. There's also the exiled Turkish journalist Can Dündar, who says that his wife in Turkey was being treated, quote, like a hostage, you write in your piece, by the Turkish state, unable to leave Turkey and fearing for her life. But as far as I can tell, this has silenced neither Kanter nor Dündar. Does this sort of thing usually work?
So you're referring to a piece I wrote, I think, with Fiona Adamson, who's been great at researching Turkish policymaking. And you're right that it's quite widespread. So beyond Turkey, China, when we were researching this, China has been at the very top of using...
With the Uyghurs, yes.
By proxy it's astounding the amount of information that is there. My sense and other researchers' sense on this is that it's a particularly potent tool. So threatening your family members back home does a lot to potential or actual political dissenters or activists in order to silence them. And the question here refers to the evidence we have. So you should keep in mind that the best instances of coercion by proxy never make it to the papers or the media, right? So we would never find out because they have already been silenced and they choose not to go on record. And we have diasporic activists that might hint at something, but they make sure to say, well, listen, you cannot mention our name, you cannot mention where we are, or anything like this. So my sense of this phenomenon is that it's much more widespread than we would believe, particularly because there's this elite bias in terms of reporting. So some people, like a basketball player, might feel much more comfortable coming out and saying, listen, this has happened to me. Ordinary or non-elites, as we would call them perhaps in political science, are much more loath to do that, which leads me to believe that this phenomenon is quite widespread, actually.
In the conclusion of the article, you consider future areas of study, including how countries balance their conflicting interests in the diaspora, such as the desire for benefits, remittances, better education, lower employment, and the desire for control, silencing dissent. Turkey, to me, seems little concerned about the former, apart from securing the votes of its citizens abroad, and much more interested in security measures. Don't most authoritarian states tend toward control and security concerns? I wonder how you see that line of research.
That's a good question. A lot of authoritarian states, both historically and currently, do rely heavily on migrant remittances or money transfer from diaspora communities back into the homeland. So I can tell you, Egypt is one, of course, where it accounts for some 10, 12% of its GDP if you look at its remittances, which it's an astounding number. So it really can't afford to lose their remittances. States like Eritrea, for instance, is another good example where they have a 2% diaspora tax, as they call it, which means that any time a person in the diaspora needs anything with regard to Eritrea or the Eritrean state abroad, there is a 2% tax on whatever kind of transaction he or she engages in. So I think Turkey is in a bit of a Turkey is the outlier here. A number of autocratic states continue to rely on the economic benefits that emigration grants them. So that's where it becomes complicated, this sort of balancing act between ensuring that as many people, as many of your citizens, if you want, go abroad and succeed and remit money or brains, if you want, back to the homeland, but at the same time do this without being encouraged to criticize or to be vocal about any sort of human rights abuses back in the homeland. So this is the balance that needs to be struck, I argue, in that piece.
That's interesting that you say that Turkey is an outlier. So it sounds like this essentially a lack of benefits frees the regime to act more aggressively with these repressive tactics. Is that right?
That would be the logical conclusion of the argument, that if at some point the regime tends to deprioritize economics, then it is able to increase its emphasis on security, right? So this would make sense. Yes.
Okay, Gerasimos Tsourapas of the University of Birmingham. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. No, this has been great.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.